Story begins. The darkroom never lied. That was the first thing Diane Calloway's grandfather ever told her about photography. She was 7 years old, standing on a wooden step stool beside him, watching images appear on white paper submerged in a tray of chemical solution. Her eyes had gone wide, her mouth had fallen open. She reached toward the tray, and he caught her wrist, gently, firmly. "Don't touch it yet," he said. "Watch. The picture is still deciding what it wants to be." She watched. A farmhouse appeared, a fence, a woman standing at the edge of a field, one hand raised against the sun, her face turned slightly away from the camera, like she was listening for something no one else could hear. "Who is she?" Diane asked. "Someone worth remembering," her grandfather said. And then, after a pause that seemed longer than the moment required, "The darkroom never lies, Diane. You can erase a digital file, you can alter a pixel. But silver and chemistry and light, those tell the truth, every time." She never forgot that. She was 44 years old now, and she still believed it. But she had never imagined that believing it would cost her this much. The town of Harlan Falls sat at the base of the Beartooth Range in south-central Montana, the kind of place people drove through without stopping unless they had a reason. Population 2,300 in summer, closer to 1,800 once the tourists and seasonal workers left. One main road, 2 diners, a hardware store, a pharmacy, a bar called the Ember that had been in continuous operation since 1951, and a small photo studio on the corner of Cascade Avenue and Route 9 that had belonged to the Calloway family for 3 generations. Calloway Photo Studio. The sign above the door was hand-painted, faded to a soft cream color that matched the old wooden facade. The letters had been touched up twice in Diane's lifetime, once by her father, once by herself. But she had always kept the original style, the same blocky serif font her grandfather had chosen in 1961. Some things, she believed, should not be modernized just because time had passed. Inside, the studio smelled of chemicals and old wood and something harder to name, a kind of seriousness. The front room held a reception desk, a small waiting area with 2 chairs, and a wall of framed photographs arranged in 3 rows from floor to ceiling. Portraits, landscapes, news images from the 1970s and 80s. The back room held the darkroom itself, a long steel sink, amber and red safe light fixtures, 3 trays arranged left to right, developer, stop bath, fixer, and the enlarger her grandfather had imported from Germany in 1968, which Diane had never replaced because it still worked perfectly. She used digital equipment when clients required it. Weddings, corporate headshots, real estate. She owned 2 full-frame digital bodies and a set of modern lenses she handled with professional competence and no particular affection. But the darkroom was where she went when she needed to think. She had needed to think a lot in the past 6 years. Her husband Paul had died in the winter of the year she turned 38. A highway accident on an icy road 20 minutes from home. He had been returning from a job site. He had been wearing his seatbelt. None of that had mattered. She buried him in March, and by April she was still going through the motions of a life she no longer fully recognized as hers. The studio saved her. Or more precisely, the darkroom saved her. She came in before dawn sometimes, when she could not sleep, when the house felt too large and too quiet and too full of spaces where Paul should have been. She would mix chemicals by feel and memory in the dark, and then the red light would come on, and she would work. And for however long she was working, she was not grieving. She was just seeing. That was what she told people in the rare moments she talked about it. Photography is just seeing. Everything else, the equipment, the chemistry, the technique, is just the mechanism of seeing. The photograph is evidence, proof that something existed in a specific place at a specific moment in time. Proof that cannot be argued away. She would need that conviction before long. But on the morning Ruth Maddox walked through the door of Calloway Photo Studio for the first time, Diane did not know that. She was behind the front desk, reviewing proof sheets from the previous weekend's outdoor wedding, marking selects with a red grease pencil the way her father had taught her. Tommy, her 19-year-old nephew and part-time assistant, was restocking supply shelves in the back. The door opened, and the small bell above it chimed. Diane looked up. The woman who entered was in her late 70s, possibly older. She moved with care rather than frailty, each step deliberate, like someone conserving energy over a long distance. She wore a heavy canvas coat despite the mild September weather, dark slacks, and lace-up walking shoes that had seen significant use. Her hair was white and cut short. Her face was deeply lined, but the lines were organized around sharp bones, cheekbones and jaw that would have been striking 50 years ago and were still striking now, in the way that structure sometimes outlasts softness. Her eyes were the most notable thing. They were pale gray, almost colorless in the studio's overhead light, and they moved across the room with a quality Diane could only describe as tactical, not suspicious, not fearful, systematic, the kind of gaze that catalogued everything it passed over and retained what it found. Diane had seen eyes like that once before, on a wildlife photographer who had spent 3 years documenting conflict zones in West Africa. The man had come to Harlan Falls to visit a relative and wandered into the studio out of curiosity. They talked for 2 hours. His eyes had moved the same way, measuring space, assessing exit points, logging everything, wasting nothing. She had thought about that man occasionally in the years since. She thought about him now. "Can I help you?" Diane asked. The woman carried a cloth shopping bag, the reusable kind, faded navy blue with a canvas strap worn soft from long use. She set it on the counter between them with both hands, the motion controlled and unhurried. "I have some film," the woman said. "Old film. I'd like to have it developed and printed." Her voice was low and steady. No regional accent Diane could immediately place. "What format?" 35 millimeter. "How many rolls?" 7. Diane nodded. 7 rolls was not unusual for someone clearing out old storage. She got several such jobs each year, adult children going through deceased parents' belongings, collectors who had found estate lots, older residents excavating their own attics. "Do you know approximately when they were shot?" A brief pause. The woman's eyes did not move from Diane's face. "Some are from 1983, she said. "The rest are from 1989. 40 years, more or less. Diane had developed film that old before. With careful handling and the right chemistry, the images would likely survive. There might be some base fog, some loss of shadow detail, but they would survive. "Color or black and white?" "Black and white." "That's good. Black and white holds up better over time. Where were they stored?" "A closet, climate-controlled building. They've been in their original canisters. Better still." "I can have the first inspection done by tomorrow morning," Diane said. "Full contact sheets by end of week. Do you want prints of everything, or just selects?" "Everything," the woman said. "I want to see everything." Diane opened the intake log. She kept paper records, a habit from her father's time she had never abandoned, and uncapped her pen. "Name?" Another pause, barely perceptible. "Maddox," the woman said. "Ruth Maddox." Diane wrote it down. She did not know that name yet. She did not know anything about Ruth Maddox. She had no reason to. Harlan Falls was a small town, but not so small that everyone knew everyone. Ruth was apparently a resident. She gave a local address, the Pinecrest Care residence on the north side of town, but Diane could not place her among the familiar faces she had photographed over 20 years of working in this studio. She handed Ruth a receipt ticket and explained the pricing. Ruth listened without reaction, accepted the ticket, and turned to leave. At the door, she stopped, turned back. "The last roll," she said. "The one from 1989. Treat it carefully. It's the most important." Diane nodded. "I treat all film carefully." Ruth looked at her for a moment in that still, measuring way. Then she left. The bell above the door chimed once, and then the studio was quiet again. Tommy emerged from the back room. "Who was that?" "New client. 7 rolls of old film." "How old?" "Early 80s and 89. Tommy whistled low. "Anything survive?" "We'll see tomorrow." But that wasn't the full story, because Ruth Maddox had walked through that door carrying far more than 7 rolls of unexposed film. And by the time Diane understood what she had accepted, her studio would never feel quite the same again. She began the first roll the following morning before Tommy arrived. The darkroom in the early hours was her favorite version of herself. No clients, no phone calls, no invoices to review. Just the chemical smell and the red light and the silence that was not really silence. The hum of the ventilation fan, the soft sound of solution moving in the trays, the occasional creak of the old building settling into the cool morning air. She handled the first canister with practiced care, loaded the film onto the developing reel in complete darkness, by touch alone, the way she had learned at 15 and never unlearned. Sealed it in the developing tank, started the timer. The process was meditative. She had always found it so. Each step had its duration, its temperature, its purpose. Nothing could be rushed without consequences. Nothing could be skipped. Chemistry was honest in that way. It did not respond to impatience or wishful thinking. It responded only to what was actually there. The first roll yielded 40 images. A house she did not recognize, modest, 2 stories, white clapboard siding. A garden in summer, well tended, roses along a wooden fence. Interior shots, a kitchen with a window over the sink, morning light slanting across a table set for 2. A living room, a hallway, ordinary domestic spaces captured with simple competence, no particular artistry, just the documentary instinct of someone who wanted a record, and people. A woman who appeared to be in her 40s in these images, dark hair, slim, standing in the garden, sitting at the kitchen table, standing at the living room window with her back partially turned. The same woman in most shots, occasionally with a man whose face was almost always turned away or obscured. Partial profiles, the back of a head, a shoulder. Diane made contact sheets of everything, marked them with the roll number, and set them in the drying rack. She moved to the second roll. More of the same house, different season. The garden was bare, the light flatter and grayer, late autumn or early winter. The woman appeared again. The man appeared again, still mostly avoidant of the camera. A few shots showed what looked like a front porch, snow beginning to accumulate on the railing. Third roll, summer again, different year. The garden more overgrown, the house showing its age in small ways. A cracked step, paint peeling at the corner of a window frame, time marking its passage on surfaces. Fourth roll, indoor portraits, closer range. The woman at a desk, writing, the woman reading, a bookshelf, a child's drawing pinned to a corkboard, but no child visible in any of the frames. Fifth roll, landscapes, open fields, tree lines, distant mountains. Montana topography, Diane thought, or somewhere very similar. The Beartooth foothills, wide sky. The human figure absent from most frames, present in a few, tiny against the landscape, anonymous, unidentifiable. Sixth roll, more domestic interiors. A bedroom, curtains drawn. A bathroom. Ordinary and intimate and slightly melancholy, the way domestic photographs often became melancholy with time, because they documented the dailiness of lives that had since changed. She processed all 6 rolls in a single long session. 11 hours. She broke twice for water, once for a sandwich she had brought from home. Tommy came and went, processing his own client work in the adjoining space, leaving her alone in the darkroom the way he had learned to do. By evening she had contact sheets for 6 rolls laid out on the light table, 204 images. She had made rough prints of a selection, perhaps 30 frames that seemed most technically successful or compositionally interesting. She spread them across the work table and looked at them for a long time. The woman in the photographs aged across the rolls. Youngest in the first, oldest in the 6th, though the span seemed compressed, 5 or 6 years at most. The man appeared in perhaps 20% of the frames, always partially obscured, always as if by accident rather than intention. Someone accustomed to being in the background, someone who had learned or chosen to avoid direct documentation. Something about the collection made Diane uneasy in a way she could not immediately name. She closed the studio at 9 and went home to the house that was still too large and too quiet. She made dinner, ate without appetite, and went to bed at 10. She lay awake until 2 in the morning, thinking about the photographs. about the dark-haired woman who appeared in so many frames, about the man who appeared in so few, about the child's drawing on the corkboard, about the fact that Ruth Maddox had said, "The last roll is the most important." She was back in the darkroom by 5:30 the following morning. She handled the 7th canister differently than the others, more slowly. She was not sure why. Some instinct, some residual unease from the night before that, had not dissipated in sleep. She loaded the reel with more than her usual care, checked the developer temperature twice, set the timer with deliberate attention. She waited in the dark. When she opened the tank and held the wet negative strip to the amber safe light, she could already see that this roll was different. Different location. The house was gone. Different interiors, higher ceilings, what looked like an institutional quality to the walls and floors. A corridor, a room with a metal bed frame and a single window. And outside the window, mountains. Montana mountains. The Beartooth Range, or very like it. She transferred the strip to the fixer, waited the required time, washed and hung it to dry. While it dried, she stood with her back against the wall, arms crossed, breathing the chemical air. 40 minutes later, she cut the dried strip into sections, loaded them into the negative carrier, and began making contact prints. The first several frames, the room with the metal bed, the window, the mountains through the glass, a table with a few personal items, a book, a coffee cup, a small framed photograph she could not make out. Anonymous, institutional, temporary feeling. Then, the woman. Older now than in any of the previous roles, her hair beginning to turn, her face changed, not just by time, something else, a quality she could not immediately name, a compression around the eyes, a set to the jaw that had not been there before, then a man. Diane adjusted the focus knob without thinking. The image sharpened. He was standing in what appeared to be a doorway, slightly backlit. His face was turned toward the camera, not deliberately, not posing, caught in a moment of turning, the way people look when they hear their name called unexpectedly. Diane stared at the print developing in the tray. She stared at it for long enough that she was supposed to move it to the stop bath. She did not move it. She knew that face, not personally, not from Harlan Falls or from any place she had lived or worked, but she had seen it. She was certain she had seen it. The specific structure of the cheekbones, the particular angle of the jaw, the set of the eyes under a heavy brow line. She had seen this face somewhere, in some context, and the context mattered because it was wrong. The context was wrong. She could not place it yet. The memory was there but not accessible, the way a word sits at the edge of consciousness and refuses to surface on demand. She rescued the print from the tray, overexposed now, darker than she wanted, and set it in the stop bath, then the fixer, then the wash. She kept working. 7 more frames. 8. 9. The man appeared in 4 of them, each time partially visible, partially obscured, but in this final roll more exposed than in any of the previous 6, as if whatever caution had governed the earlier photographs had been briefly set aside. In the last frame, he was facing the camera directly. Diane held the print at arm's length. The red light made everything look like a scene from another world. But the face was clear. The face was right there. And the memory finally surfaced. 2 years ago. She had subscribed to the Montana Tribune for most of her adult life, a habit from her father's time. The paper ran occasional retrospectives on significant state and regional events. 2 years ago, the anniversary of something, she could not remember exactly what, they had run a piece about a federal case, organized crime, money laundering, something that had touched several Montana businesses in the 1970s and early 80s. The article had included archival photographs, case files, portraits of individuals connected to the investigation. One of those portraits had been labeled Daniel Voss, federal informant, provided testimony in the 1982-1983 organized crime investigation. Killed in a suspected retaliatory attack, July 14, 1983. The face in that portrait was the face in this photograph. Diane set the print down on the edge of the tray. Her hand was not quite steady. The film was from 1989. Daniel Voss had been killed in 1983. She stood very still in the red-lit room, and the ventilation fan hummed, and somewhere outside a car moved down the empty early morning street, its engine sound swelling and fading like breath. What happened next changed everything. She almost did not investigate. That was the thing she would think about later. How close she came to printing the contacts, boxing everything up, calling Ruth Maddox, handing over the work, and walking away from what she had found. She could have told herself the resemblance was coincidental. She could have told herself her memory was imperfect, her identification wrong. She had seen one photograph of Daniel Voss from an article she had half-read 2 years ago. People looked like other people. Faces were not as individual as we like to believe. She could have. She did not. What she did instead was go to the front room, open the computer at the front desk, and search for the Tribune article she remembered. It took 11 minutes. The archive function on the Tribune's website was not well organized, and the older content was harder to navigate. But she found it. November 2022. The headline, 40 years later, the organized crime investigation that changed Montana business law. She read it again, more carefully this time. The informant program, the scope of the investigation, the arrests, the convictions, the deaths. Daniel Voss, 34, had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for immunity from certain charges. He had provided detailed testimony about the financial operations of 2 organized crime syndicates with interests in Montana's construction and transportation industries. The investigation had resulted in 17 arrests and 11 convictions. Voss had been placed in protective custody during the trial proceedings. On July 14, 1983, Voss had been killed by a car bomb outside a safe house in Billings. His wife, Eleanor Voss, had been separately relocated for her protection. Her subsequent whereabouts had not been made public. The photograph accompanying the article was small and low resolution, reproduced from what appeared to be a photocopy of an original document. A man in his mid-30s, dark hair, a slight smile that did not reach his eyes. Diane held the fresh print from the dark room beside the screen. She was a professional photographer. She had spent 30 years studying faces, understanding how light and angle and focal length distorted or revealed the underlying structure of a human countenance. She knew how to look past surface differences and identify the consistent geometry beneath. The distance between the eyes, the width of the nasal bridge, the particular alignment of cheekbones relative to the orbital ridges. She looked for a long time. Then she closed the computer, went back to the darkroom, and locked the door. She sat on the step stool, the same one her grandfather had placed there for her at age 7, and she thought. Daniel Voss had been killed in July 1983. The first 6 rolls of film were from 1983. They showed a woman who matched the general description of Eleanor Voss. The right age range, dark hair, similar build to the woman she had seen in the Tribune article's single-group photograph from a community fundraiser 5 or 6 years before everything changed. The 7th roll was from 1989, 6 years after Daniel Voss's death, and it showed a man whose face matched Daniel Voss's face closely enough that Diane could not dismiss the resemblance as coincidence. Ruth Maddox had given her this film. Ruth Maddox lived at Pinecrest Care Residence. She was in her late 70s. If she had been in her 40s in the 1983 photographs, and the woman in those photographs appeared to be in her 40s, she would be in her late 70s now. The woman in the photographs was Eleanor Voss, and Ruth Maddox was Eleanor Voss, and the man in the 1989 photographs was alive 6 years after he was supposed to have been killed. Diane sat on the step stool for 40 minutes. She was not afraid yet. Fear would come later, in layers, as she understood more. At that moment she felt something closer to the sensation she sometimes experienced when a print appeared in the developer tray, and she recognized that it was exceptional, that she had captured exactly what she intended, or something better, a kind of crystalline clarity, a narrowing of the world to the essential. She needed to understand what she was looking at before she did anything else. She went home, changed clothes, ate something without tasting it, and drove to the public library when it opened at 9. The library's periodical archive was more comprehensive than the Tribune's online records. Diane had used it before for research projects, local history pieces. She knew the reference librarian, a quiet man named Garrett, who understood research questions and did not ask unnecessary ones. She started with Daniel Voss. Everything she could find. There was more than she expected, and less than she needed. The Tribune piece had been the most detailed retrospective coverage. Beyond that, contemporaneous news articles from 1982 and 1983 about the organized crime investigation. Careful, legally hedged reporting that named defendants without providing much detail about investigative methods or informants. Voss was mentioned by name in 3 articles from 1983, twice in connection with the investigation and once in a brief death notice. Car bomb. Billings, July 14, 1983. Investigation ongoing, suspects not identified. She searched for Eleanor Voss separately. Less material. A brief mention in a 1982 community newsletter from Billings. A fundraiser, some civic organization. A list of attendees that included Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Voss. A single photograph. Too small to be definitive, but the posture, the bone structure, the way the woman held herself, it matched the woman in Ruth's photographs. Then she searched for Ruth Maddox. Harlan Falls. Nothing before 2018. A few mentions of a Ruth Maddox in connection with Pinecrest Care residents. A donation listed in their annual report. A brief mention in a local feature about longtime residents. Nothing that established her history before 2018. No previous address. No professional history. No family connections. No thread that tied Ruth Maddox to any life before she appeared in Harlan Falls at the age of, apparently, 73. People appeared in small towns with limited histories all the time. Retired people, people escaping complicated pasts, people who simply valued privacy. It was not unusual. But the absence of history, when combined with everything else Diane was holding, was its own kind of information. She was back at the studio by early afternoon. Tommy was there, running a client consultation in the front room. She greeted him, went through the back, and stood in the front room when the client left. "Tommy," she said, "come look at something." She showed him the 1989 print. She did not tell him what she thought she was looking at. She just asked him to look. Tommy looked. He was 19, with a good eye and a generation's worth of comfort with reverse image search and online archives. He looked at the print, looked at the face, and went to the front desk computer without being asked. He searched for 4 minutes. "This is Daniel Voss," he said. Not a question. "Why do you think that?" "The face, and also," he pulled up the Tribune article, zoomed in on the archival photograph. "Yeah, same person. Same bone structure around the eyes, same jawline. This guy is older in your print, maybe 6 or 7 years older, but it's the same person." "Daniel Voss died in 1983, Diane said. Tommy looked at her. "The film is from 1989, she said. He looked at the print again, then at the screen, then at Diane. "Okay," he said slowly. "So either your client has a photograph of a dead man who doesn't look very dead, or—" He trailed off, working through it. "Or the story about him being dead isn't true." "That's the question," Diane said. "Who's the old woman, your client?" "I think she might be his wife, Eleanor Voss." Tommy sat down. "This is either the most interesting thing that's ever happened in this town, or you're about to have a very bad week. Maybe both." "Maybe both," Diane agreed. That was when things took a darker turn. She returned to the studio the next morning to find the front window broken. The break was clean, a single impact point in the lower left corner, a spider web of cracks extending outward, a gap where the glass had fallen into the front room and scattered across the floor in a constellation of small, bright pieces. Diane stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a moment before going inside. She called the police department. A deputy came, walked through the studio, asked questions. Nothing appeared to have been taken. The cash box in the desk drawer was untouched. The digital cameras in the storage cabinet were untouched. The computer was on the desk where she had left it. The darkroom had been searched. Not ransacked, searched. That was the distinction that mattered. Nothing was broken or overturned, but things had been moved. The trays were in slightly different positions than she had left them. The supply cabinet was closed but not latched, and she always latched it. The negative boxes on the upper shelf were in a different order. The developing tank from the previous day's session was where she had left it. The contact sheets were where she had left them. The prints she had made of the seventh roll were where she had left them. The seventh roll's original negative strip was where she had left it, in a clear plastic sleeve in the top drawer of the light-proof cabinet. Whatever they had been looking for, they had not found it. Or they had found it and chosen not to take it. The deputy asked her if she had any idea who might have done this. She said no. He wrote things in his notebook and told her to call if she thought of anything. After he left, she stood in the darkroom for a long time. Then she went to the front desk, made a copy of the 1989 print on the flatbed scanner at the highest resolution the machine would produce, and emailed the file to herself and to a cloud storage account she had set up for archival purposes years ago. She took the original negative and the prints and locked them in the studio's fireproof safe, in the supply closet, which she had never, in 11 years of operating the studio, actually needed to lock. She locked it now. Then she called Tommy and told him not to come in until she said so. She needed to talk to Ruth Maddox. But she needed to know more first. She needed more solid ground under her feet before she walked into that conversation. She drove to the Montana State Archives in Billings on a Thursday, 3 hours each way. She had called ahead, explained she was doing research on local history, requested access to certain document collections from the early 1980s. The archivist was professional and helpful. She had a reader's card already on file from a previous research project. The reading room was cold and high-ceilinged and smelled like paper. Diane sat at a long wooden table and worked methodically through what was available. The organized crime investigation of 1982-83 had generated considerable documentation, but significant portions of the relevant files were under federal seal. What she could access was the state-level material, business registration records, property transactions, legal filings. She traced names, dates, connections. The organized crime network that Voss had testified against had been involved in legitimate business fronts, construction companies, freight operations, a hotel chain. She found a property record from 1982. A residential property in Billings, registered to a trust associated with one of the construction companies. The address matched the safe house address mentioned in one of the 1983 news articles. She found a federal court filing index from the 1983 trial proceedings. The full files were sealed, but the index listed document types. Among them, witness protection arrangement documentation, joint agreement between federal and state authorities. She found a gap in the state archives records from July 14, 1983 through October 1983. Not an absence of records. Records existed for that period. But a specific category of law enforcement communications from that 3-month window had been removed. The archive catalog listed them. The physical files were not present. Notation, transferred to federal custody, 1984. She found a single personnel record that had not been transferred. A requisition for services from an independent contractor in July 1983. The contractor was identified by a business name, not a personal name. The services were described only as photographic documentation and archival storage. The contractor address was in Harlan Falls, Montana. The contractor name was Callaway Photo. Diane sat with that for a very long time. She read it again. The paper was old, the typeface faded, the institutional language impersonal, but the words were clear. Callaway Photo, Harlan Falls, July 1983. Her grandfather had been running the studio in July 1983. Her father had been a teenager. She had not yet been born. Her grandfather had been contracted. By whom? The record did not specify. By a federal or state entity, given the context. contracted to provide photographic documentation and archival storage in connection with events that, based on everything else she had read, had to be related to the Voss case. The relocation of Eleanor Voss, the staging of Daniel Voss's death, the establishment of new identities, the filing of false records. Her grandfather had known, and her grandfather had never said a word. She drove back to Harlan Falls in the dark, the headlights cutting through the emptiness of the two-lane highway, the mountains invisible in the night, but present in the way large things are always present, even when you cannot see them, as a weight, a boundary, a fact of the landscape. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about what it meant to know something for 50 years and carry it in silence. She thought about the studio with its chemical smell and its photographs on the walls and its darkroom where truth developed slowly out of nothing. No one expected what came next. When she got home, she went to the supply room at the back of the house where she stored things that had come from the studio when she cleared some of the older storage years ago. Boxes she had moved without fully examining, her grandfather's things, equipment he had used and retired. Notebooks, she thought. He had kept notebooks. She had seen them when she was clearing the space and had set them aside with a vague intention to examine them eventually. She had not examined them. Paul had died 6 months later, and she had thought about very little else for a long time after that. She found the boxes, 4 of them, banker's boxes, labeled in her own handwriting, Grandpa Cal, Studio Records, Do Not Discard. She brought them to the kitchen table. The first 2 boxes contained what she had expected: business records, client logs, equipment manuals, receipts. Her grandfather had been meticulous and old-fashioned in his record-keeping. Every client transaction documented in a ledger, every equipment purchase filed with the receipt. The third box held personal notebooks, small, hard-covered, dated on the spine. She sorted them by year and looked for 1983. It was there. She opened it. Her grandfather's handwriting was small and precise. He had been a deliberate writer, not given to excess in any direction. The notebooks were professional records, essentially, notes on projects and clients, occasional observations about equipment or technique. They were not diaries in any confessional sense. She found July 1983. Most of the month was ordinary. Client names she recognized from the studio's history, equipment orders, a note about a camera repair. July 12th, picked up new batch of developing chemistry from supplier in Billings. July 14th, the page was blank, no entry. She turned to July 15th, a brief notation, long day, no details. July 16th, back to normal. She looked at the blank July 14th entry for a long time. In 30 years of meticulous record-keeping, her grandfather had never left a blank date in his professional notebooks. Every single day was accounted for, with at least a brief notation. July 14, 1983, the date Daniel Voss was officially killed, was the only blank page in every notebook she subsequently examined. She kept reading. August, September, October 1983. The entries resumed their ordinary character: clients, equipment, business notes, but in September, a notation that stopped her. September 9, 1983, EV called, settled, equipment returned, negatives in vault, note for the future, some things are kept, not shown, EV Eleanor Voss, negatives in vault. Diane looked up from the notebook. She was sitting in her kitchen at 11:30 at night, surrounded by boxes of her grandfather's papers, and she felt the particular sensation of understanding arranging itself, not all at once but in sequence, like a print developing in stages, each stage revealing more of the image beneath. Her grandfather had documented something. The documentation had been in a vault. If Ruth Maddox still had film from that period, film that had never been developed, film she had kept for 40 years in original canisters in a climate-controlled building, what had been in that vault? Had it been the same film, or something else? She searched the rest of the 1983 notebook and found nothing more. She searched the 1984 and 1985 notebooks and found nothing. In the 1988 notebook, September, message relayed: D, alive, Montana, E, knows, D, alive, D, Daniel. Daniel was alive in 1988. Her grandfather knew, Eleanor, Ruth, knew, and someone had relayed a message. Her grandfather had been a relay point, a trusted third party in a communication chain that connected a man who was supposed to be dead to the woman who had been made to believe she might never see him again. In 1989, the year after that notation, someone had taken photographs. The photographs Ruth Maddox had been carrying for 35 years in original canisters, undeveloped, waiting. She read the 1989 notebook next. January through June. Ordinary entries. July. D. Here. 1 day. Photographs made. No record beyond this. Trust requires silence. Some things are kept, not shown. Some things are kept, not shown. He had written it twice. The same phrase. A principle, not just a note. Her grandfather had kept Daniel Voss's presence in Harlan Falls off the record for 1 day in 1989, had facilitated the photographs, or had taken them himself, because who else would have operated the camera, and had sealed everything in silence, and Ruth Maddox, Eleanor Voss, had kept that undeveloped film for 35 years. She had brought it to Diane now. Why now? Diane closed the notebook, looked at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her in the night. Because she was old. Because she was tired. Because the people who needed to be protected were dying. Because the people who needed to know were almost out of time. Because some things are kept, not shown, until the moment arrives when they should be shown. She called Ruth Maddox's room at Pinecrest at 8 the following morning. The phone rang 6 times and went to the facility's voicemail. She did not leave a message. She drove to Pinecrest instead. Pinecrest Care Residence was a single-story building set back from Route 12, surrounded by well-maintained grounds. Inside, it smelled of cleaning products and cafeteria food and something else, the particular institutional smell of shared living. Diane asked for Ruth Maddox at the front desk, was directed to room 14. She knocked. Ruth's voice, "Come in." Diane entered. Ruth was sitting in the room's single chair, positioned near the window, looking out at the grounds. She was dressed as she had been in the studio, canvas coat, dark slacks, practical shoes. She looked, Diane thought, like someone waiting for a bus. Like someone who had been waiting for a long time and had made peace with the waiting, but had not stopped waiting. "Your prints are ready," Diane said, "but that's not why I'm here." Ruth turned from the window. Her pale gray eyes settled on Diane with that cataloging quality, assessing. "I know why you're here," Ruth said. "Do you want to tell me?" Ruth looked at the window for another moment. The grounds outside were neatly kept, nothing special. But she looked at them as if they were something she needed to remember. "Sit down," she said finally. There was only one chair. Diane sat on the bed. It was a narrow, institutional bed with a blue coverlet, and the room was spare and clean and held very few personal items. A framed print on the wall, a generic landscape, the kind that came with the facility. A small bookshelf with perhaps 20 volumes. On the windowsill, a single object, a small framed photograph, too far for Diane to make out the image clearly from where she sat. Ruth folded her hands in her lap. "What did you find?" she asked. Not defensively, more like a doctor asking a patient to describe symptoms, wanting the information before providing context. Diane told her what she had found. The face in the 7th roll, the identification, the archived records in Billings, her grandfather's notebooks. Ruth listened without interrupting. Her expression did not change during the recitation. When Diane finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather," Ruth said, "was one of 2 people in this world I trusted completely." "Who was the other?" Ruth looked at the small framed photograph on the windowsill. "Daniel." "Tell me what happened," Diane said. "Not what the files say. What actually happened." Ruth was quiet for long enough that Diane wondered if she was going to answer at all. Outside, a maintenance worker crossed the grounds with a wheelbarrow. A bird passed across the window, too fast to identify. The morning light was thin and cool. "In 1982, Ruth said, "Daniel told me he was going to talk to the FBI. He didn't ask me. He told me. He said he had been holding information for 3 years that he knew he shouldn't hold anymore. People were getting hurt. The men he had worked for, not criminal work, ordinary business, but connected to people who did criminal things. Those men were expanding, getting bolder. Someone had died. A small business owner who had refused to cooperate with certain financial arrangements. Daniel had known about the pressure campaign. He had not acted. And then the man died, and Daniel could not live with that. She paused. Her hands remained still in her lap. I was angry, she said, not because I thought he was wrong, because I knew what it would cost. I had grown up in a family with certain understandings about how the world worked, and one of those understandings was that you did not cooperate with federal investigators. It brought attention. Attention brought danger. Daniel knew that too. He chose to do it anyway. What happened when he went to the FBI? They were grateful. They had been building a case for 4 years, and they needed someone with direct knowledge of the financial operations. Daniel had that. He worked with them for 8 months. During those 8 months, our life became something else. We moved twice. We changed our routines. There were federal agents in our lives constantly, not as protection exactly, but as supervisors, as overseers, watching us, making sure we didn't run. Were you afraid? Every day. The words came without inflection, which made them heavier than any more emotional delivery would have. Not of the men Daniel was testifying against, of the process itself, of how much we had given up without understanding what we were giving it up to. The trial, Diane said. The trial went well, from the government's perspective. Convictions, long sentences. The network significantly disrupted. Daniel completed his testimony. They told us we would be entered into the Witness Protection Program. New identities, relocation. We would not be together. They said we posed too high a risk as a unit, that we could be traced through our connection to each other. We had to separate. You agreed to that? For the first time, something shifted in Ruth's expression. Not quite pain. Something older than pain. Something that had been processed so many times it had become a kind of sediment. We agreed to it because we believed they would get us back together eventually. A few months, they said. Perhaps 6 months to a year. Until the threat level was assessed and the immediate danger had passed, then arrangements would be made. She stopped. That was 1983, Diane said. Yes. And you didn't see him again until 1989. Ruth's eyes moved to the framed photograph on the windowsill. I didn't see him again until 1989, and that was not sanctioned. That was Daniel taking a risk the program did not authorize. He found a way to reach your grandfather. Your grandfather had been, tangentially, briefly, part of the logistical arrangements in 1983. A trusted civilian contractor. He had provided storage for documentation, facilitated some communications. And when Daniel needed someone to trust, he trusted your grandfather. Why my grandfather? Because Calvin Calloway was the kind of man who understood that some things are more important than his own safety. Ruth said the name, her grandfather's name, and Diane felt something catch in her chest. She had not expected to hear it. He was also stubborn. Federal agents told him certain things were classified, certain assistance he had provided would not be discussed, he would not be contacted again. He agreed to all of that. But when Daniel found a way to reach him years later, Calvin helped. Because what was being done to us, what the program had done, separating us, abandoning the promise of reunion, burying us in identities that kept us from each other, your grandfather thought that was wrong. He took the photographs, Diane said. He drove Daniel to a location. He arranged for me to be brought there separately. We had 12 hours. Ruth's voice was unchanged, steady, but she had turned her face back toward the window. 12 hours after 6 years. Your grandfather took photographs, his camera, his film, his darkroom. He said, "These are yours. Keep them until you can show them safely. They are proof that this happened. Proof that whatever the official record says, this happened." Why didn't he develop the film himself and give it to you? He did develop it. He printed a copy for himself and kept it in his vault, in case anything happened to my copies. I kept the original negatives. undeveloped, in canisters, exactly as I received them from him, because if I developed them, if I saw those images, then I would have to live with seeing them every day, and for a long time I could not afford to do that. Grief is manageable if it stays theoretical. When you have photographs, it becomes specific. Diane said nothing. She understood that particular truth better than she could have said. Daniel died in 2019, Ruth said. Natural causes. He was in Wyoming. Under a name I knew for only the last 5 years of his life, when the program became more flexible about certain communications between elderly former participants. He wrote to me. We wrote to each other. We never met again after 1989. The room was very quiet. I'm sorry, Diane said, and she meant it without any ambiguity or qualification. Ruth turned from the window. Her pale eyes were dry. She had, Diane suspected, used up the years in which crying was still possible. What remained was something harder and more durable. I brought you the film, Ruth said, because it's time. The men who designed that program, the senior officials who made the decisions, who decided that keeping us separated was an acceptable outcome, they are very old now. Most of them are dead. The few who remain are in no position to protect themselves from truth. And I am old, and I have carried this for 40 years, and I am tired of being the only person who knows what was done. You want it documented. I want it witnessed. Your grandfather believed that was the most important function a photograph could serve. Not decoration, not commerce, witnessing. Diane thought of her grandfather at the development tray, 7 years old beside him on the step stool, the photograph of the woman at the edge of the field, the way he had said, "The dark room never lies." "What do you want me to do with the prints?" she asked. "That," Ruth said, "is what I need to decide, and I'll need a little more time." But someone else had already decided to act. And that was what Diane found out 3 days later. She had returned to the studio, processed her other client work, maintained the ordinary rhythms of the business. Tommy was back. She had told him only that the situation was complex, and she was thinking through the implications. He had accepted this with the intelligent patience that was, she had decided, his best quality. On the third morning after her visit to Ruth, a man came to the studio. He arrived at 10:15 on a Tuesday morning. He was perhaps 50, medium build, with a quality of physical stillness that Diane associated with people who spent considerable time in situations where movement attracted attention. He wore civilian clothes, slacks, a dark jacket, but wore them with the particular awkwardness of someone more accustomed to a uniform. He walked into the studio the way law enforcement people sometimes walked into rooms, a brief, comprehensive scan of the space before making eye contact. "Ms. Calloway," he said, not a question. "Yes. My name is Marsh." He did not offer a badge or identification, but he did not need to. The name and the manner told her everything about the conversation she was about to have. "I work for a federal agency. I'd like to speak with you about a film development job you took in recently." Tommy was in the back. Diane was aware of him as a secondary presence, a complication. "Can you step into the back office?" she said to Marsh. Then, "Tommy, can you handle the front?" Tommy emerged, read the situation with a quick glance, nodded. The back office was small, a desk, a chair, shelving. Diane stood beside the desk. Marsh stood near the door. He did not sit, and she did not invite him to. "You developed film belonging to a Ruth Maddox," Marsh said. "Submitted approximately 10 days ago. I develop film for many clients. This particular film." He paused. Not dramatically, more like a man selecting accurate language. "This particular film contains images that are sensitive from a national security perspective. It contains photographs from 1983 and 1989, Diane said. Old film. Family images for the most part." Marsh's expression did not change. "Ms. Calloway, I'm going to be straightforward with you because I think it's more efficient. We know what's on the 7th roll. We know you identified the subject. We know you accessed the State Archive in Billings 3 days after developing the film. We know about your grandfather's involvement in 1983. She had assumed they would know. The archive visit had left a record. The database searches she had done on the studio computer would have triggered something, somewhere. The broken studio window had told her they were watching. If you know all of that, she said, then you also know that the film is currently secured and that multiple copies of the primary image exist in locations that are not in this studio. A very brief pause. You've protected your copies. I've documented what I found, which is my right, and the right of my client. Your client, Marsh said carefully, is a person under federal protection. Has been for 40 years. The terms of that protection include certain constraints on disclosure. She brought me the film herself. She may not fully understand the legal implications of that action. She's a 78-year-old woman who has been legally separated from her husband by a government program since 1983 and who didn't see him again after 1989. I think she understands the implications of her choices better than most people. Marsh was quiet for a moment. He looked at the shelves behind her, at the equipment, at nothing in particular. The individual in the photographs, he said finally, operated under a different identity for 36 years. That identity protected him. It also protected the integrity of the original investigation's outcomes. The convictions that resulted from that investigation have never been successfully appealed. If the circumstances of certain witnesses' identities are publicly examined. Daniel Voss died in 2019, Diane said. Ruth told me. He died of natural causes under an assumed name. There is no living person at risk. The people he testified against have served their sentences or are themselves dead. The officials who ran the program and made the decisions about the Voss marriage are old men. What exactly are you protecting? Another silence. Longer this time. The methodology, Marsh said. The methods used in witness protection operations are ongoing and current. Any public examination of how the program operated in a specific historical case creates templates. A journalist named Anna Ferris at the Montana Tribune, Diane said. She's covered federal state law enforcement issues for 15 years. I've met her twice. She's thorough, careful, and she has a law degree. She paused. I haven't contacted her yet. I would like to resolve this without needing to. Marsh looked at her. She looked back. What does Ruth Maddox want? He said. I'll ask her, and I'll let you know. He considered this for what felt like a long time, but was probably 20 seconds. I'll leave a number, he said. He took a card from his jacket pocket, plain white, a phone number, nothing else, and set it on the desk. When you know what she wants, call that number. He left. Diane stood in the small office for a moment after he went, the card on the desk like a chess piece someone had placed and walked away from. No one expected what came next, because what came next did not come from Ruth or from Marsh or from any of the parties Diane had already mapped onto this situation. What came next came from the fourth box of her grandfather's papers, which she had not yet opened. She went home that evening and opened it. Inside, not business records, personal items, a small collection of things her grandfather had kept outside the professional notebooks, letters, a few of them, a program from a concert in 1971, some family photographs she recognized, a folded road map of Montana, heavily annotated with handwritten notes she could not immediately parse, and at the bottom of the box, a sealed envelope, sealed with old tape that had gone brown and brittle, the seal still intact. On the front, in her grandfather's handwriting, for whoever carries this forward, open when the time comes. She did not open it immediately. She set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. Then she made tea. Then she sat down. She opened it. Inside was a single typed letter and a smaller sealed envelope. The letter read, "If you are reading this, then something I have kept for a long time has finally found the person it was kept for. I have thought often about who that would be, and I hope it is someone from this family, because what is in the smaller envelope is connected to this family's history in ways that matter. In 1983, I was asked to assist with certain arrangements by people who presented federal authorization. I had no way to verify fully and no reason to doubt. I was asked to provide photographic documentation, secure storage, and communication relay for a witness relocation matter. I agreed. I was told the arrangement was temporary and confidential. The arrangement was not temporary. The people I assisted were left in conditions I had not been told to expect. I learned this gradually over subsequent years, through occasional contact I maintained against the terms of my agreement. I maintained that contact because I believed the terms of my agreement were secondary to the human obligations I had undertaken. In 1989, I arranged one meeting, 12 hours. I photographed that meeting because I believe some things should be witnessed and some witnesses should be permanent. The smaller envelope contains the prints I made from that session. I have kept them for 40 years. They belong to the woman I helped. If she is still living, give them to her. If she is not, give them to whoever needs them to understand what was done. The darkroom never lies, remember that. Calvin Calloway, 1992. Diane sat at the kitchen table for a long time after reading it. Her grandfather had written this in 1992, 3 years after Daniel Voss's visit, 2 years before cancer took him at the age of 67. He had sealed the prints and the letter and put them at the bottom of a box of personal effects and waited for whoever would find them. He had known, or hoped, that someday the time would come. She did not open the smaller envelope that night. She set it carefully aside. She thought about what she knew and what she did not know and what came next. What came next was a phone call to Anna Ferris at the Montana Tribune. She did not call immediately. She spent 3 more days talking to Ruth, learning the full shape of what had happened, understanding the dimensions of what Ruth wanted to do with the time she had left. Ruth was measured and deliberate in those conversations, but she was also resolute. She had not brought the film to Calloway Photo Studio on an impulse. She had been planning this for some time. She had known or calculated what would be set in motion. "I want it on the record," Ruth said, in their last conversation before Diane made the call. "Not for me. I'm too old for it to change much for me. But there were others. Other couples separated by the program. Other arrangements that were made temporarily and became permanent. Some of those people are still alive. And their families don't know why certain things happened the way they did. Why someone disappeared. Why contact was severed. Why the official story didn't quite match the story they sensed was underneath. They deserve to know," Diane said. "Everyone deserves to know what was done to the people they loved," Ruth said. "That's not a complicated moral position." Diane called Anna Ferris that evening. She had met the journalist twice, once at a community forum on land use issues, once at a fundraising dinner. She knew Ferris by reputation better than by personal acquaintance. The reputation was consistent, rigorous, patient, allergic to conclusions she could not document. She explained the situation in broad terms, what she had developed, what she had found in the archives, what her grandfather's notebooks contained. She did not mention the envelope yet. She listened to Ferris ask questions, precise, specific, journalistic questions that told her Ferris understood exactly what she was describing. "This is significant," Ferris said. "If everything you're telling me is accurate and documentable. I have documentation, original negatives, a chain of custody I can establish. You'll need more than that. You'll need Ruth Maddox to be willing to go on record, even with certain protections in place. I'll ask her. And you'll need to talk to an attorney before we go any further. Do you know anyone in federal litigation?" She did not. Ferris gave her 2 names, and that was where things shifted again, because one of the attorneys Ferris recommended, when Diane called and explained the situation, told her something she had not known. There had been other complaints, other former participants in the same witness protection program or programs adjacent to it, who had filed formal complaints about the conditions of their separation from family members. The complaints had been largely dismissed on technical grounds, but they were on record. An attorney named Whitfield had been building a case, quietly, for 3 years. Whitfield's office was in Missoula. Diane drove to Missoula. The office was on the second floor of an old building near the university. Whitfield was in his late 50s, with the permanently exhausted look of someone who had spent decades fighting large institutions on behalf of individuals and had learned to measure progress in very small increments. He shook Diane's hand, sat her across his desk, and listened to her for 45 minutes without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandfather was Calvin Calloway." "Yes." "He was mentioned in a deposition, one of my clients. The deponent described a photography contractor who had assisted with relay communications in 1983. The program documentation listed the contractor by business name only, but we were able to trace it." He paused. "Your grandfather kept notes, you said. Notebooks from 1983 through at least 1992, and the original prints from 1989. Still sealed in the envelope my grandfather sealed them in. I have them." Whitfield leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at her. "Ms. Calloway," he said, "what your grandfather did, maintaining contact, facilitating that 1989 meeting, preserving documentation, those were acts of considerable moral courage and considerable legal risk to himself. He did all of that with no guarantee that it would matter. He believed it would eventually." "It will," Whitfield said. "It may take another year or two. These things move slowly. But what you're holding is material to an ongoing legal action, and your willingness to provide it is—" He paused, choosing his word. "Significant." She was back in Harlan Falls by evening. She went to the studio. The studio was quiet in the early evening light, the front window long since repaired. The space returned to its ordinary appearance. Photographs on the walls, chemical smell, the particular quality of light that came through the westward-facing window in the late afternoon, warm and slanting and honest. She went to the darkroom. She opened the small envelope her grandfather had sealed in 1992. Inside were prints, 8 of them, printed on the same paper stock she still used in the studio. Her grandfather had been specific in his preferences, and she had maintained his suppliers. 6 by 8-inch prints, handled carefully, stored in acid-free paper. 40-plus years old, but preserved. She spread them on the light table. They were the same images as the 7th roll of film Ruth had brought in. The same location, the same subjects. But these prints were her grandfather's versions, his choices about exposure and contrast, his decisions about which moments to preserve most fully. They were better than hers, not dramatically but definitively. He had been a better printer than she was, with more years of practice and a particular precision in his work. The images had weight. The images had truth. There was one she had not seen before, a frame that had not appeared in the roll Ruth had given her, or that she had not printed because it had seemed less important at the time. A frame of Ruth and Daniel together, seated at a table facing each other. Ruth was saying something and Daniel was listening, and neither of them was looking at the camera. They were looking at each other with the particular focused attention of people who know that their time is limited and refuse to waste any of it on anything except the essential. Diane set that print aside. She would give it to Ruth. The others she scanned at full resolution, encrypted the files, distributed them to 4 separate locations. Then she called Whitfield's office and left a message explaining what she had. Then she called Marsh's number. "I've spoken to an attorney," she said when he picked up. "There's ongoing litigation you're probably aware of. I've provided documentation to that attorney. I've also spoken to a journalist. The journalist has not yet filed anything and has agreed to a brief delay to allow legal processes to proceed." A silence. "What does Ruth Maddox want?" Marsh asked. "She wants it acknowledged. She doesn't want a public spectacle. She wants a formal acknowledgement that what was done, the indefinite separation, the broken promise of reunion, the administrative abandonment, was wrong. And she wants that acknowledgement to extend to the other cases like hers." "That's not a small thing." "No," Diane agreed, "it isn't. It will take time. She's aware. She's also 78 and in fragile health. Time is not abundant. Another silence. I'll make calls, Marsh said. I know you will. She hung up and stood in the studio. Outside, Route 9 was quiet. A pickup truck moved down the main street. The evening light was fading toward blue. The mountains, invisible now in the growing dark, were there in the way they were always there, present, constant, indifferent to everything that happened in their shadow, and somehow reassuring for exactly that indifference. Ruth called at 9 that evening. He called me, Ruth said. Marsh. He said there was movement. There will be more movement. It may take time. That's all right. A pause. Diane, your grandfather's prints. I have them. I'd like to bring them to you. Yes. Another pause, longer. I've been thinking about the last frame, the one where Daniel is listening to me and neither of us is looking at the camera. It's a beautiful frame, Diane said. I was telling him about this town, Ruth said, about Harlan Falls, how I had come to find it peaceful, how I liked the mountains, how I had been to your grandfather's studio and seen the photographs on the walls. This was 1989, before you were running it, when your grandfather was still there. I told Daniel the town had a photographer who understood what witnessing meant. And Daniel said, then you're in the right place. Diane felt something shift in her chest, not quite grief, something more like recognition. I'll bring you the prints tomorrow morning, she said. She came to Ruth's room at 9 the following morning. The light was coming in through the window at a low angle, clear and cold. Ruth was in her chair, hands folded, waiting. Diane set the prints on the small table beside the chair. Ruth looked at them one by one, slowly, without speaking. She looked at each print the way you look at something you have imagined for 40 years and are finally seeing, with the particular attention that comes from knowing you will need to hold this image in your mind for a long time. When she reached the last print, the one of Ruth and Daniel at the table looking at each other, she stopped. She held that print for a long time. Diane sat on the bed, hands in her lap, not speaking. Outside, the grounds were quiet. The morning was cold and clear. A bird passed the window, some kind of hawk, she thought, circling once and disappearing to the north. Ruth set the print down. She placed it face up on the table beside the others. She smoothed the edge with one finger. In 1983, she said, when everything changed, I asked your grandfather a question. I was very frightened. I didn't know where they were taking me. I didn't know when I would see Daniel again. I asked him, is there any chance this ends right? What did he say? He said, I've been developing photographs for 40 years. In all that time, I've never once put an image in the developer and not been surprised by what appeared. The picture is always more than you thought it was going to be. That's what I believe about most things. You have to let it develop. She picked up the print again. It developed, she said. Diane walked home through Harlan Falls that morning, through the October cold, hands in her jacket pockets. The town was quiet at this hour, the main street not yet fully awake. She passed the hardware store, the pharmacy. She passed the Ember, its neon sign dark at this hour but legible. Open since 1951, the words worn and steady. She stopped in front of the studio and looked at it. 3 generations. The same sign, the same window, the same bell above the door, the same darkroom in the back, with the same steel sink and the same 3 trays and the same amber and red lights that had illuminated, over 6 decades, an accumulation of documented moments, births and deaths and ordinary Tuesdays, the entire texture of a life lived in a small place and not without meaning. Some things are kept, not shown, until the time comes. She unlocked the door. The bell chimed. The chemical smell greeted her like something alive. She turned on the front room lights, put the kettle on the small electric burner behind the front desk, pulled on her apron. Tommy arrived at 9:30, brought coffee from the diner down the street. They did not talk about Ruth or Marsh, or the ongoing processes she had set in motion. There would be time for that. Instead they worked, a portrait session in the morning, some archiving in the afternoon, the ordinary machinery of a studio that had been in continuous operation for more than 60 years. At some point in the late afternoon, Diane went to the dark room. Not for any specific task, just to stand there. Just to be in the space that had been her grandfather's and her father's, and was now, in whatever remained of her working life, hers. The ventilation fan hummed. The trays waited in their proper positions, left to right. Developer stop bath fixer, the chemicals ready. The enlarger ready. The paper in its light-proof box. Everything ready for whatever needed to be seen next. She stood in that readiness for a long time. 8 months later, the Montana Tribune published a series of articles, 3 parts, 18,000 words, fully documented. Anna Ferris's byline. The articles detailed the history of witness protection program separations in the 1980s, the specific cases of several individuals who had been promised temporary separation and had received permanent isolation, the legal and administrative failures that had allowed those situations to persist. Ruth Maddox, identified by her given name, Eleanor Voss, was one of 4 primary subjects. The articles included a photograph, not the 1989 prints, something different, a photograph Diane had taken of Ruth in her room at Pinecrest, the morning she had brought her grandfather's prints. Ruth was looking out the window at the grounds. The low morning light caught her face from the side. A hawk was visible in the upper corner of the frame, a dark shape against the pale sky. It was the best photograph Diane had taken in years. The series generated significant response, congressional inquiries, an official review of the Witness Protection Program's historical separation practices, a formal statement from the relevant federal agency acknowledging that certain relocation decisions made in the 1980s had resulted in outcomes that did not meet standards of care and warranted review. It was not an apology. Whitfield said an apology was unlikely. Ruth said she was not interested in an apology anyway. An apology, she said to Diane on the phone after the formal statement was released, is what you give someone before you ask them to forgive you. I'm not in a position to forgive. I'm in a position to know that it's on record. That's enough. The smaller envelope with Diane's grandfather's prints was entered into Whitfield's legal files as evidentiary material. Certified copies were made. The originals were returned to Diane with a legal receipt and a notation that they were her property by right of inheritance. She framed the print of Ruth and Daniel, the last frame, the one her grandfather had captured without either of them looking at the camera, and hung it in the front room of the studio. Not on the client wall, not among the commercial work. On the opposite wall, the one her grandfather had kept for photographs he considered significant. The wall that held, among other things, the photograph from 1971 that a 7-year-old Diane had watched develop in the tray. The woman at the edge of the field, one hand raised against the sun, listening for something no one else could hear. The woman in that photograph, Diane had eventually learned from her grandfather's notebooks, had been a client from the studio's early years. Her name was not recorded. She had come in once, had one roll of film developed, had never returned. Some people passed through and left an impression that outlasted any knowledge of them. Some photographs outlasted their explanations. Some truths survived because someone had the instinct and the equipment and the understanding that witnessing required commitment to the moment, to the image, to the permanent record of what had actually happened. The darkroom never lies. Diane closed the studio at 6 that evening. She turned off the front room lights, checked the darkroom, checked the locks. She stood at the door for a moment before stepping outside. The fall evening was cold, the mountains visible against the darkening sky, their shapes familiar and enormous. The main street of Harlan Falls was mostly quiet. A few cars, the pharmacy lit up, the Ember with its neon sign beginning to glow against the early dark. She locked the door. The bell chimed once behind her, the way it always did, the way it had for 60 years. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the sign above the door. Callaway Photo Studio. The hand-painted letters, touched up twice in her lifetime, holding their shape. She thought about her grandfather, at his developing trays in 1989, watching 2 people's faces emerge from chemistry and light. Watching the truth appear, keeping it safe for the day it would be needed. She thought about Ruth, holding a print after 40 years, smoothing the edge with one finger. She thought about Paul, gone 6 years now, and the way the studio had been a place she could go when the house was too quiet, a place where she could work and see and not feel quite so lost. She thought about what her grandfather had said. The picture is still deciding what it wants to be. Everything was still deciding what it wanted to be. She buttoned her jacket against the cold and walked home through Harlan Falls, through the town she had grown up in and returned to and committed her working life to, through the familiar streets under the enormous Montana sky, through the quiet that was not really quiet, but full of things too patient to be hurried, too true to be silenced, too important to be kept hidden any longer. Some truths wait decades to surface. Some photographs wait 40 years to be developed. Some witnesses wait a lifetime before they are called, and some darkrooms, in some small towns, in some families that have carried certain things without fully understanding what they were carrying, are ready when the moment finally arrives. The chemical smell never quite left her. She had stopped noticing it years ago. It was just part of who she was, the solvent and the fixer and the developer, the particular metallic sweetness of silver in solution, the smell of truth being made permanent. She walked home. Behind her the studio held its quiet, the prints on the walls, the darkroom waiting, the grandfather's notebook in its box, the framed photograph of two people looking at each other across a table in 1989, in a room in Montana, with 12 hours to say everything they had needed to say for 6 years, and the understanding that the camera was not what they were looking at. What they were looking at was each other. What the photograph proved was that this had happened. What the darkroom had refused to forget was everything.